guests today. Firstly, we have Ndiame Diop, Regional Vice President for Eastern and Southern Africa, World Bank. Ndiame, great to have you here. Then we have Modupe Famakinwa, Head of Funding, Capital Markets and Investor Relations at the Africa Finance Corporation. Modupe, thanks for joining us. We have Sheikh Omar Diallo from Total Energies. He's the leader of Task Force Communication and a spokesperson for their project in Uganda, the Tilenga project. And finally, we have Cassidy Walters, Managing Director for Power at the Rockefeller Foundation. Cassidy, good to have you here. Firstly, I wanted to try and for us to put the energy transition into context. Transition suggests moving from one position to another. And for the developed world, it's really about moving from a fossil fuel-based energy system to a renewable-based energy system. In many African countries, however, they're still developing their energy systems and don't yet have universal energy access. So let's try and get a sense of what the situation is like on the ground today. What do the statistics tell us about energy production per capita across the continent and access to electricity, and how has that changed over the last decade? Sheikh, as our kind of co-host, I thought I'd come to you first. I mean, at Total Energies, what's your view? In your mind, are African countries making fast progress in rolling out universal access to energy, or is that being hampered? What's it?
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon to all, or good morning, wherever you can be, and thank you for attending this webinar. Today, what is the situation today in Africa? The figures now, they come to be very not famous but well known. Half of the population in Africa don't have access to electricity. This is roughly 600 million. We do have 900 million of people in Africa. They don't even have access to clean cooking solutions. Today, when we take the consumption of electricity in Africa, it is roughly 730 terawatt-hours. If I want to give a comparison today, it is quite equivalent to the consumption in a European country, Germany, when we take the consumption of electricity in Africa today. So it is very low. It is very, very low. At the same time, we do have an increasing population, so we do have more and more needs in terms of electricity. We do have a lot of countries in Africa affected by climate change. When we take today the most countries suffering from the climate change worldwide, 8 are in Africa. You do have, for example, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. And this is kind of bills Africa is paying. I am saying a bill because Africa does not contribute to the global warming today, to the global change, by emitting roughly 3% of the GHG. So the transition is key for Africa today. It is key to give access more electricity to people. It is key to fight against climate change. When we have said that, the next step is to say how to deal with this. In terms of financing, just having access to electricity, according to the International Energy Agency, we often need 30 billion per year, USD per year. Today we do have roughly 3 billion invested. So there is a huge gap to finance today. And when we are talking about transition in Africa, fair transition in Africa, it means to say how now to finance this gap. There is donations with foundation like Rockefeller Foundation, which are really in. There are loans with the World Bank, but we not develop and we not give access to electricity to everyone in Africa just on the basis of donation. At the end of Africa should also rely on its own resources. And what we are thinking about today, a fair transition and regarding the landscape, is that Africa does have a lot of mineral resources, a lot of fossil fuel resources, and are saying that with a responsible governance and operation of these resources, Africa can have all the means to give access to energy. It is really for the population in Africa because it will contribute to education, contribute to health, to boost economy, and so on. So very low consumption in terms of electricity, huge needs in terms of financing compared to the continent, and now how to deal with this.
Yeah, thanks, Sheikh. Cassidy, maybe I can come to you. I mean, I know the Rockefeller Foundation, you could study these trends. Do you agree with Sheikh's analysis of the situation? And when you look at the rollout of energy system in Africa, say, over the last decade, optimistic about the pace of progress or pessimistic?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to FT Live and my fellow panelists. Really delighted to be involved in this conversation. I think Sheikh laid it out well. You know, we're talking about Africa contributing just 4% of global emissions, per capita energy use at 180 kilowatt hours, as compared to 13,000 kilowatt hours per capita where I am here in the United States. So when we're talking about an energy transition, of course, that looks dramatically different for Africa than it does in North America, Europe, or even Asia. Here in Africa, I would say what we're facing is what Jude Moore, a colleague at the Energy for Growth Hub, calls an existential crisis of energy poverty. And to no, we're not keeping pace with location. We're far behind targets to end energy poverty, achieve universal energy access in Africa. And I really agree with Jude that this is an existential crisis that we all have to meet to accelerate the pace of electrification. Sheikh shared the figure 600 million unelectrified still in Africa. At the current pace of electrification, we're not even set to keep up to keep that number flat at the current pace of electrification. And since we know there's a direct link between per capita energy use and GDP growth, this is really the time to focus on getting this right and increasing the speed of electrification. However, I think there's a point here. When we at the Rockefeller Foundation have looked at modeling out energy growth and growth in consumption over time, it's absolutely true that Africa is not an emitter today. However, if Africa meets its electrification goals, it stands to be a large emitter. And so it's important to consider how renewables can be part of an energy mix, especially when they can sometimes be the fastest and least cost means to get energy on the grid.
Thanks, Cassidy. Ndiame, let's go to you. I just wondering about this kind of a whole idea of the energy transition and whether that language is kind of holding back electrification in Africa or speeding it up. I mean, I feel like I sometimes hear the argument from kind of fossil fuel proponents that actually, look, Africa can't afford to be selective about only choosing low carbon solutions, and it just needs to be, I guess, kind of energy agnostic and just develop whatever is available. I mean, is that a tension when people talk about the rollout of energy systems in Africa? What are your thoughts?
Thank you very much, Tom. I very much agree with both Sheikh and Cassidy that accessibility or access to reliable, affordable energy should be a priority for Africa. Now, once you define affordable, reliable access or universal access as the key priority, the next question is, how do you achieve that, right? So I think that the approach that we use at the World Bank is for different countries to look at the resources that they have, the needs that they have, their country context, and then ask the question, what is the least cost mix to meet the energy needs in that, the electricity needs in that country? For some countries, and for many countries right now, given the rapid decline in cost of solar and wind, in fact, the least cost or the lowest cost path to universal electrification, is solar and wind. However, for all these countries that have different goals of industrialization, but also for the reliable energy, many of these countries will have to mobilize also their resources in terms of hydro, in terms of geothermal, and in terms of natural gas. So it's really about the mix that makes sense, and that's in particular countries, given the resources that they have, given the needs they have, and so on. It's not either or. It's not one size fits all. It's not a zero-sum game. I think it's really a mix that makes sense in a particular country, given the resources that they have. And there are some technical dimensions to it. For example, if you go 100% solar and wind, which is intermittent source of energy for the most part, you will have to invest in battery storage and in making your grid smart so that it can handle the electricity coming from those sources. Therefore, it makes sense for such countries to really look at those investment options and compare them to really more steady sources of supply coming from geothermal, coming from hydro and natural gas. And in fact, that's what countries are doing. They're really mobilizing the resources that they have to have a mix of steady supply, but also use renewable energy for peak load. During peak hours, solar can be very handy in terms of helping you smooth the fluctuation, but you do need a base load that is reliable and that ensure 24/7 supply of electricity. So this is really the sort of short-term with which this African energy equation.
Tom, if I may,
Please, Sheikh, go ahead.
Yes, just to complement what I've been just said. In addition to the technical way, that is to say, what we should find in terms of solutions, wind, hydro, and so on, that we do in Africa, which is how we can raise funds. Today, except loans and donations, Africa just attracts 3% of the world investment in the energy sector. So you do have the continent representing 17% of the worldwide population, just attracting 3% of the worldwide investment in energy. So we do have also, in addition to the reflection on which solution in terms of renewable or fossil fuel energies, there is also, I think that there is also a thought or reflection on how attracting more investment in our countries to fill the gap.
Yeah. Modupe, let's bring you in. At the African Finance Corporation, how do you think about transition? This question of should a green transition or should fossil fuels play a role? And perhaps in answering that, what is the AFC's position on funding those two different types of energy solutions?
Tom, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to all my panelists. The thoughts I've heard so far are quite interwoven, and from the AFC's perspective, it's pretty similar to how we view things. We view the transition as not a one or the other. We don't think it's a binary decision to be made between, perhaps fossil fuels and renewable. The way we see it is every country on the continent needs to make use of all of the energy resources available to them in order to meet their, energy needs. We find that, the ultimate goal is, in energy future. But, it's a case of how do we get there and how can we get there pragmatically? For instance, if you look at natural gas in some countries and in some parts of the world, natural gas is seen as, dirty fuel. But the truth of the matter is it's a step above, using diesel. Right, so we sort of need to be pragmatic about this transition. We can't simply adopt the transition models that have worked in more developed parts of the world, especially given the continent is still quite behind industrialization, and energy is a strong prerequisite for that industrialization. Now, how do we think about funding it? For us, like Chek had said earlier, funding is a critical issue. and we see only a small part of the total liquidity pool available to renewable energy on the continent for several reasons. Some of it being, capital will only be attracted where there's, the right regulation, where you have, the right, credibility, etc. For us, we take the approach of accessing as many sources of funding as possible. We are fortunate that we have great relationships with some of the DFIs around the world that have specific funding pools for climate. So for instance, we recently signed a transaction with CDP of Italy, which was mainly for climate strategic initiatives. So we take advantage of those. There's also, of course, the fact that there's a lot of funding coming from Europe that is looking at specific renewable projects and at specific cost of funding. So, the ability to fund is also difficult because you then have a lot of money chasing only a few projects, and then it leaves the rest of the classes, the rest of the not so green sources of energy at a detriment and unable to fund themselves in a sustainable manner. So for us, we see ourselves as, just gathering access to as many as possible. We get money from our markets, we deploy it to these sources. We don't think you can completely eliminate coal and mining, but we do think you can do it in a sustainable manner and in a pragmatic manner. And that's the way we assess our ability to deploy funding to these classes. But, just to summarize, I think, it's very important that the need for energy is important. We can't afford to rely on just the one source. So we need to try as much as possible to make all sources available and to fund them as practically as possible. So I'll just take a pause here.
I think, in the past decade, we've seen quite a rigidity from some and financiers into African energy mix. And I think where we are now is, as my panelists have said, this is a moment for focus on energy abundance and an all of the above approach. And so I think even, in Jame, the decision of the World Bank recently to reconsider nuclear as a fuel, this is really a time to keep every option on the table. Thank you.
Thanks, Cassidy. Yeah, and Jame, let's go to you. Has the World Bank changed its kind of financing policies vis-a-vis energy options in Africa? Have they shifted in any way in the in the past decade? And then I guess kind of as a follow-on to that, what do you think? What are the best kind of innovative around at the moment to try and bridge the funding gap that we've been talking about?
So let me first talk about the funding gap. I think mobilizing financing is absolutely critical, and it requires all stakeholders working together and blending their financial support to really unlock investment. Now, the World Bank, thanks to the IDA replenishment, is committed to devote large amount of resources to this agenda. And in fact, as part of Mission 300, which is an initiative aimed at connecting 300 million people in Africa by 2030, we are looking at more than $30 billion of investment in this sector. However, that investment, even if it's largest among all the partners, is not enough. We need to leverage the funding from the other development partners. It's been mentioned, we are collaborating with many development partners, whether it's the French, the Nordics, Italy, and many other partners to really just leverage so that we can use strategically the funding that we provide to deliver financing at scale. But let me mention the importance of bringing in private sector, because many of the countries in the continent face very limited fiscal space. And this is really something that is important to keep in mind. Therefore, leveraging and catalyzing and bringing in private sector capital is absolutely critical, I think, in achieving the goals that we set for ourselves. But now that private sector capital will not come on its own, it will require putting in place the right regulatory environment for that investment to be de-risked and to be deployed at scale. It also requires using financial instrument and financial innovation to make sure that private sector comes in at scale. And that refers to reforming the utilities, because if the off-taker or the main off-taker is the utility, and that utility is not financially viable, private sector will hesitate to bring in capital because of the risk associated with whoever is the off-taker of whatever power is generated. In some countries, we do have mining companies as off-takers. There, the risk is lower, but for the most part, the national utility is the main off-taker of energy that is generated by the private sector. So engaging with the national utility companies, helping them to improve their performance, their financial viability, and their bankability is absolutely critical in bringing in more capital in the energy sector. The World Bank has really step up its effort in terms of using financial instruments to accompany our traditional concessional funding and grants that we provide to countries. For example, the guarantee instrument. It is absolutely critical, especially when you face utility companies that are still being reformed. It's really important to bring in guarantee, and the bank has created a guarantee platform across World Bank, IFC, and MIGA, increase the volume of guarantee that we provide, but also to tailor guarantee solutions that are very, very specific to the different needs of the sector, such as the distributed renewable energy segment of the energy sector. So we need all of these fundings together to really achieve the goals. Now, I must mention that we are quite optimistic, and we've seen as part of the Mission 300, countries very committed drafting their compact, in which they're very clear about and very specific about how they will achieve universal access by 2030, what type of project they line up, and then we're working on the financing to finance those projects. So, and we're seeing already significant progress. For example, just between the launch of Mission 300 and now, 25 million people have been connected. And we're seeing progress that have been implementing their national program over the last 4 or 5 years. One example is Tanzania, that has doubled its access rates over the last 5 years, connecting 8 million people and getting the grid to nearly 100% of the villages in the country. Malawi is another example where 4 million people have been connected, and 1,000 school and health facilities have been as well connected over the last 4 years. And we have other examples, but all of that started from a very low base. Some countries started actually 5 years ago with an electricity access rate of 20% or 25%, 30%. So if they double it, it gets us today to 60%. Still have a gap of 4% of the population without access to electricity. And that's really what is at stake in the next 3 to 4, 5 years. And that's what we are really laser focused on to really help these countries get to universal access, which is fundamental because, as was said earlier, without electricity, it will be very difficult to achieve high rates of growth. For the economies to transform, you need energy. For even closing the human capital, the gaps in health, the gaps in education, you need energy. And for creating jobs at scale, you need energy. So this is really, really central to the agenda of the World Bank, and we're putting a lot of resources and energy into supporting countries to meet this data.
If I may just add to that, because one of the critical things we're also seeing is just the need for the early stage project preparation facilities, because we find that, it's a bit difficult for some projects to get to financial close because the early, funding required for, feasibility studies and all of that early thing, takes some time and requires funding. So one of the things that we are doing as well at AFC is to set up what we call project development facilities, just to ensure that we can get projects around, energy, around, energy infrastructure on stage and support to financial close. That way, these projects are a bit more appealing to investors who are more amenable to taking risk further down the chain. So I think, this is also a very critical piece that we need, ourselves and a lot of the other multilaterals are already doing this. But I think, this is also a critical state, because what we find is we don't have enough of these projects on the continent to provide the energy that we need. And the more of these projects we can get to financial close, the easier it will be for us to bridge the infrastructure gap on the energy space.
Thanks, Modupe. Sheikh, maybe I can bring you back in. Ndiame and Modupe both talked about some of the financing challenges for the private sector. For Total, when you're doing renewable power projects on the continent, I think you are doing some. What challenges do you face? Do you self-finance those, or do you need to look for funding? And how do you find the interactions with, for example, the utilities?
Yes, we do invest, and we do invest in renewable energies in Africa because it is part of our ambition, which is net zero by 2050. Yes, we need loans. So a lot of has been said by my previous speakers in terms of investment in grids, in terms of regulatory framework. There is also the issue linked to stability of the framework, because when we do invest in maybe in a 20 or 25 years. So if we do have every time some changes in the taxes policies, in the regulatory framework, it could be really challenging for our project. There is also issues in terms of payments, because we have talked about national companies and national utilities companies. So this could appear as risky when you have to be paid if they are not really strong. So a lot has been said. My conviction is that we need loans, we need donors for that. But at the end of the day, what we need, it is a business model for Africa regarding electricity, because we not give access to electricity to everyone in Africa just with donation. It is impossible. We will have to develop the private sector, and we have talked about the condition like this. I will not repeat this condition, but we do have really an issue in Africa. Again, we do not attract a lot of investment. This is a fact. And if we don't remove and we don't solve the issue linked, we've said about the grid, about putting in place a regional cooperation about having strong regulatory framework and so on. If we do not put this in place, yes, we'll give access to electricity with some people, but I'm not sure that we'll reach our target, which is giving access electricity to everyone. So we do have huge challenges. Huge challenges. I'm optimistic. It's just, as it is, I'm optimistic. You have seen some countries like Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania, Senegal, and so on. They made a lot of progress. This means that it is possible. But for the other countries, we should deal with what we have talked about.
Can I comment on this one point? Because I think we are talking about the private sector, etc. It is really important to keep in mind two characteristics when it comes to investing in the energy sector. First, it's capital intensive. It requires quite a lot of money. And then secondly, there are high risks associated with regulations that may change over time, associated with an off-taker utility that is not financially viable, etc. So it's absolutely, private sector is telling us in many countries, many projects, is that if a development partner is not there to lower the cost of the investment and to help de-risk the investments through guarantees and engagement with government on policy reforms, they may not enter the market. So this is why I think the package of support that for example, we provide at the World Bank, which is engagement with the government on policy and regulatory reform. Indeed, you need certainty of the regulatory framework for private investment to come in. You need the off-taker to really reform so that it is viable, and guarantees and some of the instruments that I mentioned, but also development partners grant to soften the cost and investment by development institution in transmission and critical infrastructure. So that really, really, really central in really unlocking private sector investment. I think this is really an important point to keep in mind.
Yes.
Yeah, let's bring in Cassie. And I wanted to pick up a couple of questions from the audience. Cassie, I'll bring you on this one. So there's a question here: how can Africa achieve universal energy access when so much energy infrastructure is geared toward export? I mean, that's certainly historically been the case with fossil fuels and with minerals. But I wonder whether that's still relevant with renewable energy. And it actually links to a kind of another question about green hydrogen. So there's one of the viewers says many European countries relying on this idea of importing green hydrogen in the form of ammonia from African countries. I guess linked to this idea of like exporting energy, these green hydrogen projects, is that a positive thing? The person asks, is that a blessing or a curse? Or should Africa be thinking about dealing with its domestic energy demands before kind of monetizing energy as an export commodity?
Well, that links to the green hydrogen question, but I mean, I think Mission 300, as Njame mentioned, is absolutely focused on universal energy access for Africans as opposed to exporting energy. And as the Rockefeller Foundation, we saw an opportunity to partner with the World Bank and the African Development Bank on Mission 300 as a really singular initiative to make clear advancements on energy access. And that was based on essentially three things. One, the commitment to policy and regulatory reform, as Njame mentioned, that can actually drive in and crowd in that private sector investment. The focus on speed and delivery and doing things differently. We know that when IDA-backed loans for energy projects can take 7 to 8 years for completion, from planning to actually delivering electricity. And that's just not a timeline that is going to work to meet this 2030 goal. And finally, the focus on energy for development. About half of the Mission 300 numbers will need to come from off-grid energy. So really a focus there on electrifying the last mile and making sure that every African is connected. And the grid can do that in some places, and others, off-grid solutions have to be part of the mix. And our focus here is on making sure that those off-grid solutions are helping communities and small businesses grow their economic value, and not just about lighting, but really about Mission 300 as an initiative to drive jobs and drive economic opportunity.
Thanks, Cassidy. And there's an interesting question here about gas versus solar. The question is essentially, if an African country has an unexploited gas deposit, does it always make financial sense to develop that deposit? Or with the cost of renewable power coming down, could there actually be an argument, particularly given the difficulties of financing certain types of fossil fuel projects? I mean, could you make an argument to leave it in the ground and use that money and that time and government attention to invest in solar instead? I don't know if anybody has a strong view on that.
I mean, I could speak to that, and I think that's an interesting nuance that comes up ever so often. But when we look at even globally and look at other developed markets and see what percentage of the energy source comes from renewables, it's like less than 10% in a lot of economies. And I think given the statistics we've all mentioned, 600 million Africans don't have electricity. Depending on the source you look at, it just shows there's a huge gap. I don't think we have the luxury of choosing one source over the other. I think each country will need to look at their energy mix and what works best and try to harness all. It's a case of we kind of need all hands on deck here. So if you have a large natural gas deposit that works and that can be developed, I think that should be prioritized. The solar, renewables, etc. as well, it should also be prioritized. I don't think we can use one or the other. We sort of need to have a strategic plan to harness as much as possible, especially when we think about the existing base load. It's going to take some time. We need to build base load. It's not something that's going to happen in a year or two. And given the targets we see across the continent, we can't afford to run with one hand behind our back. I think is the way I would look at that.
I think that's a really, really useful view, Modupe. Ndiame, would you agree with that?
I totally agree with that. I think countries should stay in the driver's seat. They should be choosing from a range of options that reflect their context, their resources, their goals, without locking in high emission, right? So I fully agree with that. And in some cases, the gas deposit or the natural gas can be the least cost option, given that what is available in the country. So it makes total sense to just exploit those resources. And one good example, I think, which the World Bank Group has supported, is the gas to power project, Teman gas to power project in Mozambique. We supported Mozambique to draw on its domestic, gas resources by providing guarantees, equity, and investment in the transmission, which has really brought the private sector to come in and invest. That has really had one consequence, which is Mozambique has a more diversified energy mix as a result of that. It doesn't just depend on hydro, because during the dry season, hydro may not provide sufficient electricity for the country. Now, if you have the gas and the hydro, and we are also investing in renewable, Mozambique will have a mix that will be affordable because it's based on least cost, but also reliable, ensuring 24/7 electricity. So I think it does make sense. Now, to your question about export, look, I think it's a matter of optimization, right? We do have in the region many countries that are net importers and countries that are exporters and importers, right? Just to give you one example, Kenya. Kenya imports electricity in some period from Ethiopia, which has a surplus of hydro. But in other period, Kenya would export electricity to Tanzania, for example, or Uganda. So my sense is that trade is also a way of regulating the supply of electricity, because some sources are not as steady as one would wish, and having trade or being able to trade is a way to really maintain or stabilize the supply of electricity in the country. It's rather something that we support, and interconnectivity of different countries is really a great achievement for many countries in the region. And it's still a very important agenda, I think, to support, so that at the end of the day, while you're developing your resources, you can import from your neighbor or export to your neighbor, so that the region as a whole will have more stable energy supply.
Thanks, Ndiame. Sheikh, I'll come to you on this one. Very straightforward question, but a useful one. In your opinion, which African countries are doing particularly well? I mean, you mentioned a couple kind of earlier, but I was wondering if you could develop that a bit further. Which countries are approaching the energy transition well and executing, and what is it that they're doing which is working?
Yeah, in terms of country, what I can say that is we do have some countries in Africa. I was talking about Rwanda, Kenya, Senegal, and so on. They are on the good trend regarding the energy transition. And for this country, I think that they did not make any competition on the stop and so on. They did use all the resources. For example, in Senegal, they have recently launched the Sangomar project. It is oil project in Senegal, as well as now GNL LNG project in Senegal, Grand Tortue. So they have taken a model based on the fact that there is no competition, and what is important is how it is the governance around all the revenues linked to this project, and it is also to have a strong model regarding access to electricity. So the different countries, these countries did not make any competition among their resources. And what I do think at the end of the day is that regarding all this, it is finally how we do use the revenues of mineral, fossil fuel, and so on. How we do use these revenues, and what is governance, the strong governance around these revenues. So we do have different examples, and as I was saying, no competition among this. We do need all the resources. We do need to tap into this in a responsible manner. I do insist on a responsible manner. And we do need also to go towards the energy transition, but by combining all these resources.
Cassidy, what are your thoughts on that? Are there any particular countries or particular projects that stand out as kind of good examples of good policy and good execution?
Yeah, I thought Sheikh had great examples. I would think about it a little bit from the off-grid side, where we're highly focused. And there are some really exciting examples of new ideas developing in the distributed renewable energy and really the mini grid business model. And as many folks on this call will know, the mini grid model has been challenging in Africa because it's difficult to also stimulate sufficient demand to make that business model profitable for developers. And so some models that we see that are really exciting are those of interconnected mini grids that are being deployed in Nigeria and will be scaled up through the World Bank funded DARES project there. So these are mini grids that are actually connected to the grid so that you can pass energy back and forth. In Zambia, we are supporting an innovative subsidy that's focused on demand stimulation. So this is a subsidy for developers who, they often need CapEx subsidy, but this is focused on OpEx. So how do you actually support developers to stimulate energy demand through helping people understand what kinds of tools, technologies they're able to deploy in support of their businesses once connected to energy? And then finally, something that we've been really excited to support through, and this is a grid project, not off-grid, through the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, GEAP, is a first of its kind utility scale solar plus storage project in Malawi. We know that we need more storage on the grid in order to deploy renewables faster, and so it's a really exciting project to see taking off.
And thanks, Cassidy. A question on nuclear energy here, which I think is useful. Given the growing demand and the push for clean, reliable power, is it time for Africa to explore nuclear energy? I think one of the panelists earlier mentioned the World Bank shifting position on nuclear, and that didn't just pertain to Africa, that was a global position. But Diame, what do you think about nuclear power in Africa? Should it be an option? I think, there's a nuclear power station in Egypt? Actually, no, it's not even built yet, right? But I think it's being developed, and the one in South Africa, but that's it.
Yeah, the World Bank is updating its energy strategy, which will define, the sort of our modus operandi in this area. So what we've discussed so far is definitely gas downstream and midstream. We will continue to advise and to finance. Nuclear, we're open to consider, especially given the development of the technology. We saw modular technology that exists. And in some countries, it could be the best option, in fact, for energy access and energy supply. So the bank is looking into that. We are planning to, the reality is we don't have expertise in-house, or very limited expertise in-house, because we haven't been involved on nuclear for a long time. We are partnering with the International Atomic Energy, really look into this more thoroughly. and certainly deliberate on where we go from here. But definitely our new strategy is looking into this with greater openness, and considering all the different dimensions of the issue, safety, but also availability of resources in countries and so on. So that's where we are on that, but definitely open to that.
Tom, if I could add, from the Rockefeller Foundation position, we see too often that innovative technology is at the forefront of energy efficiency, energy abundance, whether it's nuclear or AI, are considered inappropriate for Africa because of the cost or other reasons. And so we were really excited to see that actually Rwanda hosted the first Nuclear Energy Innovation Summit for Africa a couple of weeks ago, and a colleague of mine attended. Our view is that Africa should be looking at all of these technologies, and that foundations and other donors can be additive in helping to create deployment pathways for these kinds of technologies. Of course, as Njame mentioned, there are big challenges around grid and otherwise to actual deployment, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be on the table.
Thanks, Cassidy. Maybe just time for a final question here, which again comes from the audience, which I hadn't thought of. Maybe to you. I mean, the question is, what role can youth and local innovators play in accelerating energy access? And I guess just kind of building on that, it kind of gets me kind of thinking, listening to all of you speak this morning. I mean, does energy feel like an exciting field in Africa right now? Is it a sector that is getting graduates kind of excited in kind of creativity and innovation? How do you see it?
No, I think everyone has sort of come to the realization that in order to move the continent forward, we need to be able to drive industrialization. A key catalyst to industrialization is energy in some form or the other. A key catalyst for innovation, the ability to product and be creative across sectors, across industries, across the creative space, across the finance world, across science. It's critical. And the one thing we think we can do at AFC is a lot more vocal that about that we've written a couple of thought leadership papers. We recently wrote our part one, and we're having a lot of conversations around convening and bringing stakeholders to the table. How can we impact on policy? How can we impact on regulation? How can we create an environment that doesn't make foreign capital shy? One of the other creative things we're looking at is perhaps we need to look inwards a lot more and focus on domestic resource mobilization. If we look, for instance, at our pension funds, our central bank reserves, a significant portion of that goes offshore and then comes to the continent in the form of expensive Eurobonds, expensive loans, etc. The continent is not asking for aid. The continent is asking for charity. But, perhaps we need to take our destiny in our own hands a lot more. If we can create products locally that, these funds can go into, the pension fund industry across Africa is in the trillions of dollars. Imagine what that does if it's invested locally. Imagine the amount of savings on interest expense that sovereigns would have. So we're spending a lot of time focusing on saying how we can set up infrastructure in place locally that drives capital, that causes capital to stay on the continent and causes it to be assigned to our development priorities. And I think it might seem like a small thing, but I think it will move the needle quite dramatically.
Thank you, Modupe. Look, I think that's an excellent way to draw this afternoon's discussion to a close. So look, that's all we've got time for. But firstly, a huge thank you to all the four panelists, to Ndiame, Modupe, Sheikh Omar, and Cassidy. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. And also a reminder that if you want to watch this again, or if you want to share this with colleagues, it'll be available on the FT website for the next 30 days. Thank you to Total Energies for partnering with the FT and making this poll. And that is all from us here at the FT Live team. So Thanks again, and hope you tune in to another discussion.